The rain had been a merciless thing, a cold gray sheet that fell for 3 days, turning the trail into a churning trough of mud and despair. Now, a weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the aftermath. It didn't bring warmth, only a harsh light that made the scene starker, the misery more defined. The world smelled of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the cloying scent of sickness that clung to the small canvas tent pitched beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. Inside, Eliza burned. The fever was a thief, stealing her strength, her memories, her sense of time. The world was a slurry of muffled voices, looming shadows, and the constant rhythmic shivering of her own small body. Outside, the community of the wagon train was a silent jury. They stood in a loose, uncomfortable semicircle, their faces grim, their gazes averted from the tent as if looking too closely might invite the fever into their own wagons, their own families. They were good people, she dimly remembered. They had shared salt and stories around campfires. Their children had played tag among the prairie flowers. Now they were strangers, their kindness eroded by fear. The unseasonable storm had put them days behind schedule. The mountain pass ahead would soon be choked with snow. To wait was to risk everyone. The math of survival was a cruel and simple arithmetic. Samuel Hartwell stood apart from the others, his posture as rigid as the rifle he held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was the leader, a man whose pragmatism had been forged on the anvil of the frontier. His face, weathered and stern, showed no indecision. He had made the calculation. He was looking at the mountains, at the sky, at everything but the small tent that held the dying child. His wife Martha stood beside him, her hands twisted in her apron, her face a roadmap of anguish. Her pleas had already been made. Her tears had already fallen on the hardened ground of his resolve. "It's a mercy, Martha," he had said, his voice low and flat, meant only for her but carrying on the cold air to the ears of others who pretended not to listen. "She's burning up. She won't last the night. To move her is to torture her. To stay is to condemn us all. We leave her to God." God felt very far away. Eliza, in a moment of fleeting lucidity, heard the finality in his tone. The words were not a prayer, but a verdict. She tried to call out, to say she was still here, that a flicker of life still stubbornly clung to her bones, but her throat was a desert, and the only sound that escaped was a dry, rasping breath. The flap of the tent was pushed aside. It was Samuel. His shadow fell over her, large and absolute. He didn't look at her face, but at the worn woolen blanket tucked around her. He placed a metal canteen of water and a small, hard biscuit wrapped in cloth on the ground beside her pallet. A final provision, an absolution. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul, child," he murmured. The words were a formality, hollow as a dried gourd. He backed away, letting the canvas flap fall, plunging the tent into a dim, suffocating twilight. Outside, the sounds began, the creak of wood, the groan of axles, the low calls of men urging their oxen forward. It was the sound of departure, the sound of abandonment. A wave of terror, so potent it momentarily eclipsed the fever, washed over Eliza. She fought against the leaden weight of her limbs, dragging herself across the damp ground, her fingers clawing at the canvas flap. She pushed it open just enough to see. The wagons were already moving, lumbering giants turning their backs on her. She saw the faces of the other children, peering back with wide, curious, uncomprehending eyes. She saw Martha Hartwell, her shoulders shaking with sobs as she was helped onto the wagon seat by her husband. Samuel did not look back. He cracked his whip, and the sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot, severing the last tenuous thread that connected her to the world of men. She watched them go, a slow funereal procession crawling up the muddy ridge. Her world shrank with every turn of their wheels. The blue calico dress her mother had made for her, the one she loved for the tiny violets printed on the fabric, was now soaked in sweat and mud, a flimsy shield against the profound cold that was not just in the air, but inside her. The last wagon crested the hill, a final dark shape against the bruised sky, and then it was gone. Silence. It descended upon the clearing like a physical weight. It was a silence deeper than any she had ever known, filled only by the drip of water from the oak leaves and the frantic hummingbird beat of her own heart. She was 8 years old. She was alone. She was left to die. The terror was a wild animal in her chest, clawing at her ribs. She crawled back from the opening of the tent, curling into a tight ball, her forehead pressed against the damp, cold earth. The fever, which had been her enemy, now became a strange sort of refuge, its swirling fog a barrier against the unbearable reality. She closed her eyes, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of heat and darkness. The great oak tree above her stood as a silent, solitary witness to the small, fading life beneath its boughs. The fever was a tide, pulling her out into a disorienting sea of nightmare and memory, then pushing her back onto the jagged shore of consciousness. Time lost all meaning. There was the burning, the shivering, the thirst that felt like swallowing sand. Once she woke with a start, the terror fresh, and scrabbled for the canteen Samuel had left. Her clumsy fingers fumbled with the cap, spilling more of the precious water than she managed to drink. The liquid was a brief, cool miracle on her parched tongue before the fire in her blood rose again to consume it. The biscuit lay untouched, a rock she had no strength to conquer. As dusk began to bleed into the edges of the day, painting the clearing in shades of purple and gray, a new element intruded upon her solitary suffering. A presence. It was not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck, the ancient instinct of the hunted. Her fever-glazed eyes struggled to focus on the edge of the woods, where the shadows were deepest. She saw nothing, but she felt it. A watching. She told herself it was the fever, another phantom born of the heat that cooked her brain. But the feeling persisted, a low, constant hum of awareness beneath the roaring static of her illness. The sun vanished completely, and the world was plunged into a profound, starless dark. The cold intensified, seeping up from the ground, a relentless predator. Her shivering became convulsive, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She was a tiny, flickering candle, and the wilderness was an immense, patient breath, waiting to snuff her out. Then she saw them. 2 points of light, low to the ground, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. Yellow. They blinked, and were gone. Then they reappeared, closer this time. Another pair joined them, and another. They were eyes. A constellation of feral stars emerging from the blackness, silent, patient, and fixed upon her tent. Wolves. The word was a jolt of pure, ice-cold adrenaline that cut through the fever's haze. The stories told around the wagon train campfires came rushing back. Tales of livestock savaged, of lone travelers who vanished, of the pitiless hunger of the pack. Her breath hitched in her throat. She was too weak to scream, too weak to run. All she could do was watch as the eyes drifted closer, moving with a fluid grace that was utterly soundless. They were not rushing, not charging. They were flowing, a river of shadows pouring into the clearing. They stopped some 20 yards from the tent, a semicircle of silhouettes, their forms barely distinguishable from the surrounding night. The only thing real about them were their eyes, dozens of them, all trained on the flimsy canvas that was her only shield. A strange standoff began, a sick, helpless child and a pack of wild predators. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Eliza's terror was so absolute it became a kind of paralysis, a state beyond fear. She was a mouse cornered by owls, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the indifferent silence of the night. The wolves did not move. They did not growl. They simply watched, their collective gaze a palpable weight. Her feverish mind began to play tricks on her. The glowing eyes seemed to swirl, to multiply, their stillness taking on a hypnotic quality. Was this death? Had it come for her in the form of golden-eyed specters? She felt a bizarre detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching the scene unfold from a great distance. A sound finally broke the spell, But it didn't come from the wolves. It was a rustle in the undergrowth behind the tent, followed by the sharp crack of a breaking twig. The effect on the pack was instantaneous and electric. A low growl rumbled through them, a sound that vibrated in Eliza's very bones. It was not a sound of aggression aimed at her, but of warning, of territory. The yellow eyes shifted their focus, turning as one toward the new sound. From the deep shadows near the base of the great oak, a new shape emerged. It was low and sleek, a fluid ripple of muscle moving with sinuous confidence. It was a mountain cat, a cougar, its tawny coat almost invisible against the dark earth. It was larger than any of the wolves, a solitary hunter of immense power. It had likely been drawn by the scent of sickness, the scent of easy prey. It ignored the wolves, its pale, predatory eyes fixed on the tent, on the prize within. What happened next was a blur of primal violence. Before the cat could take another step, one of the wolves, larger than the others, her coat a striking shade of silver in the faint starlight, shot forward. She didn't bark, she didn't howl. She was a silent, gray arrow aimed at the intruder's flank. The cat, surprised by the challenge, twisted with a furious snarl, its claws unsheathed. But the she-wolf was not alone. The entire pack moved as a single entity. They did not charge recklessly, but flowed around the confrontation, their movements a masterclass in coordinated attack. They harried the cat from all sides, nipping at its legs, its hindquarters, forcing it to spin and defend itself from a dozen different angles at once. The clearing erupted in a symphony of snarls, hisses, and the thud of bodies colliding. It was a brutal, swift, and terrifying ballet. Eliza, peering through the small opening in her tent, watched with a mixture of horror and stunned disbelief. They weren't attacking her. They were fighting for her? The thought was absurd, a fever-induced delusion, but the evidence was undeniable. The mountain cat was clearly focused on getting to the tent, and the wolves were a living, breathing wall of fur and teeth, denying it access. A strange thing happened then. As if sensing her vulnerability, two of the younger wolves detached from the fray and trotted silently to the entrance of her tent. They didn't enter. They lay down on either side of the opening, their bodies tense, their eyes still fixed on the fight, but their presence forming a new, definitive barrier. They were guards. The battle reached its crescendo. The silver she-wolf, displaying a breathtaking combination of speed and ferocity, found an opening. She lunged, her jaws closing on the cat's throat. The cougar let out a choked scream and thrashed wildly, its powerful hind legs kicking, but the she-wolf's grip was iron. The rest of the pack swarmed, and the fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The great cat lay still in the mud. The night fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of abandonment, but the charged silence of aftermath. The pack was breathing heavily, their forms dark against the slightly paler ground. One or two were limping, but they were victorious. The silver she-wolf let go of the cat, her muzzle stained dark. She stood over her kill for a moment, then she turned. Her luminous yellow eyes found Eliza's, peering out from the tent. She held the girl's gaze for a long moment. There was no menace in her look, no threat. There was something else, something ancient and unreadable. An assessment, a declaration. Then, with a quiet dignity, she walked back toward the center of the clearing, and the pack followed, leaving the body of the mountain cat where it lay. The two guards at the tent door remained, their breathing the only sound in Eliza's new, strange, and terrifyingly safe world. The tension of the last hour had broken the fever's hold, leaving her drenched in sweat, shivering with cold and a dawning, incomprehensible awe. The wolves had not come to kill her. They had come to protect her. The adrenaline that had flooded Eliza's system during the fight ebbed away, leaving a bone-deep cold in its wake. The fever, though its delirium had lessened, still simmered beneath her skin, but now the immediate threat was not the fire within, but the frost without. The night air was sharp, and the dampness from the ground leached warmth from her small body with a terrifying efficiency. Her shivering intensified, each tremor a small spasm of defeat. Death, she thought with a strange clarity, would not be a violent tearing, but a quiet freezing. A slow, gentle fading into the blackness. She curled herself into the tightest ball possible, pulling the thin, damp blanket around her shoulders, but it was useless. It was like trying to stop the tide with a sieve. She closed her eyes, a kind of surrender. Her thoughts drifted from the wolves to her mother, a warm, soft memory of being tucked into bed, the weight of a thick quilt, a promise of safety. A tear, hot from the fever, escaped her eye and traced a cold path down her temple. The two wolves still stood guard at the entrance to the tent, motionless sentinels. The rest of the pack had settled in the center of the clearing, some tending to minor wounds, others simply resting, their collective breathing a soft, rhythmic sound. The air was thick with the coppery scent of the dead mountain cat, a grim incense. Then, a subtle shift. The silver she-wolf rose. She moved with a deliberate, fluid grace, her paws making no sound on the muddy earth. Eliza's heart, which had just begun to slow, picked up its frantic pace again. The she-wolf was coming towards the tent. The two guards watched her approach, but made no move to stop her. She paused at the entrance, her great head silhouetted against the faint starlight. Her yellow eyes seemed to glow with a soft, steady light, and in them, Eliza saw not the predator that had torn the throat from a cougar, but an intelligence, a questioning. The she-wolf nudged the canvas flap aside with her nose and stepped inside. The tent was small, and her presence filled it completely. She smelled of wildness, of damp fur, pine needles, and fresh blood. It should have been terrifying, but it wasn't. Eliza was too cold, too weak, too far past fear to react. She simply watched, her body trembling uncontrollably. The she-wolf looked down at the shivering child, a low, almost inaudible sound rumbling in her chest. It was not a growl, but something softer, a kind of communication Eliza couldn't understand with her mind, but felt in her gut. With a slowness that seemed to acknowledge the girl's fragility, the she-wolf lay down. She didn't touch Eliza at first, but settled beside her, her body a long, powerful line of muscle and fur. Then carefully, she shifted closer, pressing her flank against Eliza's back. The warmth was instantaneous, a shock to Eliza's chilled skin. It was a profound, living heat, a furnace of animal vitality. It was more potent than any fire, more comforting than any blanket. It was life. Slowly, tentatively, Eliza stopped resisting the shivers and allowed her body to lean into the heat. She felt the steady rise and fall of the wolf's breathing, a rhythm as ancient and soothing as the tides. A moment later, another wolf, a younger male with a scar on his muzzle, entered the tent and lay down on her other side, adding his warmth to the cocoon. Soon, another followed, and another, until Eliza was no longer a lone, dying child on the cold ground, but the warm, protected center of a pile of sleeping wolves. The pack, which had minutes before been a symbol of terror, had become a living, breathing quilt. The fear that had been her constant companion for what felt like an eternity finally receded, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and a strange, overwhelming sense of security. Nestled in the heart of the pack, surrounded by the musky scent of their bodies and the furnace of their collective warmth, Eliza fell into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time since the wagons had left. She awoke to sunlight slanting through the tent opening, dappling the sleeping forms around her. For a moment, she was disoriented, the memory of the night feeling like a fever dream. But the solid weight of a wolf's head on her legs and the gentle warmth radiating from the furry bodies pressed against her were undeniably real. The pack was still asleep, a tangle of gray and brown fur, paws twitching in dreams of the chase. The silver she-wolf lay beside her, her great head resting near Eliza's shoulder, her breathing slow and even. Eliza lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, studying the wolf's face. The fur was thick and coarse, tipped with silver that gave her her name. A long scar ran down her snout, a testament to a life of conflict and survival. In sleep, her face was not fierce but serene. Slowly, carefully, Eliza sat up. The wolves stirred, but didn't wake. The fever had broken. The fire in her blood was gone, leaving behind a profound weakness and an aching emptiness in her stomach that was more than just hunger. It was a hollow craving for life itself. She crawled to the tent opening and looked out. The clearing was bathed in the crisp morning light. The body of the mountain cat was gone, dragged away into the woods during the night. The world felt clean, washed, new. As if sensing her wakefulness, the silver she-wolf stirred and rose. She stretched, a long, luxurious flex of her powerful body, and padded out of the tent. She gave a soft yip, and the rest of the pack began to wake, stretching and greeting each other with nuzzles and licks. They were a family. The realization struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. The way they moved together, the intricate social dance of their morning ritual, it was all imbued with a sense of belonging that she had lost. She was an outsider, a spectator to their intimacy. The she-wolf's gaze fell upon her, and she seemed to understand. With another soft bark, she trotted to the edge of the woods, and 3 other wolves followed her. They disappeared into the trees with a purpose that Eliza recognized. They were going to hunt. The remaining wolves, mostly younger ones, stayed in the clearing, lounging in the sun, play-fighting, and occasionally glancing towards the small human who sat watching them from her canvas cave. Hours passed. The emptiness in Eliza's stomach grew into a gnawing, painful knot. She drank the last of the water from the canteen, but it did nothing to quell the hunger. She looked at the hard biscuit Samuel had left, but her stomach revolted at the thought of the dry, tasteless thing. Her body craved something else, something vital. Late in the afternoon, the hunting party returned. They came out of the woods as silently as they had entered, the she-wolf in the lead. In her jaws, she carried a rabbit, its body limp, its fur unstained except for a single dark spot on its neck. She walked directly to the tent and dropped the rabbit on the ground before Eliza. Eliza stared at it. The rabbit was still warm. Its eyes were open, black, glassy beads staring into nothing. The smell of fur and fresh blood rose from it. A wave of nausea, a memory of a different life, washed over her. Her mother cooking rabbit stew over a fire, the meat clean and white, the smell of herbs and civilization. This was not that. This was raw, savage. The thought of putting the bloody flesh in her mouth was repulsive, a violation of everything she had ever been taught. Her stomach churned with a civilized disgust. But beneath the disgust, another, more powerful instinct was stirring. The hunger was no longer just a pain in her belly. It was a primal command, a desperate scream for survival echoing in the marrow of her bones. Her body, starved and weak, knew what it needed. It needed meat. It needed blood. It needed the life force that lay cooling on the ground in front of her. She looked from the rabbit to the she-wolf. The wolf was watching her, her head cocked, her yellow eyes steady and patient. It was not a command, but an offering, a test. The choice was hers. The world of her past, of cooked stews and clean hands, had left her here to die. This new world, this world of wolves and blood, had saved her life and was now offering her sustenance. Her hand trembled as she reached for the rabbit. The fur was soft, the body still pliant. She hesitated, her mind screaming no, while her body screamed yes. She closed her eyes, the image of Samuel Hartwell's back as he walked away flashing behind her eyelids. He had left her a biscuit. The wolves had brought her life. With a small, choked sob that was half grief and half gratitude, she lifted the rabbit. Her teeth, small and human, were not made for this. But her desperation gave her strength. She found the wound the wolf had made and tore at it, sinking her teeth into the raw, warm meat. The taste was metallic, overwhelming, and utterly, primally satisfying. It was the taste of survival. Juice and blood ran down her chin, staining the front of her tattered blue dress a deeper, darker color. She ate ravenously, tearing at the flesh with a ferocity that surprised her, driven by a hunger so profound it erased all thought. When she was done, she looked up. The she-wolf was still watching her. Seeing that Eliza had accepted the offering, she gave a soft woof of what could only be approval, then turned and walked away to join the rest of her pack. Eliza looked down at her hands, at the blood and scraps of fur clinging to her fingers. She looked at her dress, the garment that represented the girl she used to be, now irretrievably stained. A line had been crossed. The girl who loved the scent of her mother's stew was gone, and in her place was a creature who had tasted raw life to keep her own. She had made her choice. She had sealed her bond. She was no longer just a lost child. She was part of the pack. She wiped her mouth with the back of her bloody hand and felt not disgust, but the first stirrings of a wild and terrible strength. The days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the waxing and waning of the moon. Eliza's old life faded like a photograph left out in the rain. The blue dress, once a treasured link to her mother, became a ragged tunic, its color leached by the sun and stained by earth and blood, a mere remnant of a forgotten identity. She shed her human habits as a snake sheds its skin. The fear of dirt was replaced by the comfort of the earth. The silence she once dreaded became a language richer than any words she had known. She learned the ways of the pack, not as a student learns lessons, but as a lung learns to breathe. She learned that a low growl could mean a dozen different things, from a warning to an expression of contentment. She learned the subtle flick of an ear that signaled a distant sound, the shift in posture that meant prey was near. She began to understand the yips and barks, the joyous howls that greeted the rising moon, not with her mind, but with an instinct that bloomed in the space her human words once occupied. Her own voice grew rough from disuse, the few words she had once known dissolving into the back of her memory. The silver she-wolf was her constant companion. Eliza came to call her Silver in the quiet of her own mind, the name a silent acknowledgement of her grace and strength. Silver was her protector, her teacher, her anchor in this new world. She would bring Eliza the choicest part of the kill, nudge her with her nose when it was time to move, and sleep pressed against her back every night, a warm, living shield against the cold. Eliza, in turn, learned to groom the thick fur on Silver's neck and shoulders, her small fingers working through the tangles, an act of mutual care that cemented a bond deeper than any she had ever known. She was no longer Eliza, the abandoned girl. She was little Furless, Shadow, a presence defined by her relationship to the pack. The old oak tree, once the site of her abandonment, became her sanctuary, the hollow at its base her den. She learned which roots were edible, which berries were safe, her knowledge guided by watching what the wolves ignored. Her body changed. The soft flesh of a civilized child hardened into sinew and muscle. Her skin, constantly exposed to the elements, darkened and toughened. Her senses, long dulled by the noise and smells of human society, sharpened to a razor's edge. She could smell rain on the wind hours before it fell. She could hear the rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth 50 feet away. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the forest, learned to see in the gloaming as well as any nocturnal creature. She was becoming wild, not by choice, but by necessity, and in that transformation, she found a freedom she had never imagined. This life was not an idyll. It was hard, and it was often brutal. She saw death up close, the swift, merciless end of a deer in the jaws of the pack. She felt the gnawing ache of hunger when hunts were unsuccessful. She endured the biting winter winds and the sweltering summer heat, with only her own resilience and the warmth of the pack to sustain her. But unlike the cold, calculated abandonment by her own kind, the hardships of the wild felt honest. They were part of a great, indifferent, but ultimately balanced cycle. Here, survival was earned every day, and life, because it was so precarious, was intensely precious. One late summer afternoon, when the air was thick and heavy with the promise of a coming storm, a sound intruded on her world, It was a sound from her past life, alien and jarring in the green silence of the forest. The rhythmic, grinding creak of a wagon wheel. Eliza froze, her hand halfway to her mouth, with a handful of wild blackberries. The pack, lounging nearby, also went still. Ears perked, noses lifted, they all turned their heads in the direction of the sound. It was distant, but unmistakable. And it was getting closer. A strange cocktail of emotions churned within her. Fear was there, a cold, familiar ghost. But there was also a flicker of something else, a deeply buried memory of belonging to that other world. Martha's kind face, the laughter of the other children. Did she miss them? Did she want them back? The question was a confusing jumble in her mind. She looked at Silver, who had risen to her feet, a low rumble starting in her chest. The she-wolf's yellow eyes were fixed on the ridge, her body coiled with a tense, protective energy. Her loyalty was clear, and seeing it clarified Eliza's own feelings. This was her family now. Those creaking wheels were not the sound of salvation, they were the sound of intrusion. They came over the ridge, just as they had left. 4 wagons, stark and angular against the sky. They were moving slowly, cautiously, back the way they had come. A broken axle, a lame ox, a decision to turn back before the mountains claimed them. The reason didn't matter. They were here. They pulled to a halt at the edge of the clearing, by the great oak. The men who dismounted looked tired, gaunt, their journey a failure. Then one of them pointed. A woman screamed. Eliza realized they were pointing at her. She stood by a thicket of berry bushes, her hair a wild, matted tangle, her skin brown and scratched, the tattered remnants of her blue dress barely covering her. She was a creature of the woods, and their gazes were a mixture of shock, horror, and disbelief. Martha Hartwell scrambled down from her wagon, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Eliza? Oh, dear God, is that you?" Her voice was a choked whisper. Samuel Hartwell followed, his face a mask of grim astonishment. He stared at her, then his eyes flickered to the side, and his expression hardened. The pack had not fled. They had risen and formed a loose, protective semicircle behind Eliza, Silver at the forefront. They were not growling aggressively, but their presence was a clear, silent warning. They were a wall of muscle and teeth between their human and the intruders. "It's a miracle," a man's voice said. It was Thomas Wheeler, his face filled with a genuine, stunned awe. "She's alive." But Samuel Hartwell didn't see a miracle. He saw an abomination. He saw a child living among beasts, a perversion of the natural order. His gaze, cold and hard, swept over the wolves, lingering on the powerful form of the silver she-wolf. He saw them not as protectors, but as captors, as savage animals that had somehow corrupted the girl. Fear and revulsion twisted his features. "Stay back, Martha," he commanded, his voice sharp. He turned back to his wagon, his movements stiff with purpose. He reached inside and pulled out his rifle. The long, dark barrel gleamed with a malevolent light in the afternoon sun. It was the symbol of his world, the tool used to tame the wild, to destroy what was not understood. "Samuel, no!" Martha cried, her voice filled with panic. But he ignored her. He saw the situation with the brutal pragmatism that defined him. The girl was alive, but she was with wolves. To get to the girl, he had to eliminate the threat. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the metal stock settling against his cheek. He took aim, his sight zeroing in on the chest of the magnificent silver she-wolf who stood unflinchingly between him and the child he had once abandoned. The world seemed to hold its breath. The climax was at hand, a confrontation not just between a man and a wolf, but between 2 worlds, 2 definitions of family, 2 truths, and Eliza was standing directly on the fault line. The click of the rifle's hammer being pulled back was a small, sharp sound that cut through the heavy air with terrible significance. It was the sound of a decision made, a final, violent answer to a question no one had asked. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. Eliza saw it all with a preternatural clarity. Samuel's narrowed eye, the dark, round O of the rifle's muzzle pointed directly at Silver's heart. Martha's face collapsing in horror, Thomas Wheeler starting to move but being too far away. She saw Silver, who did not flinch, did not back away, but instead pushed her head forward slightly, a subtle gesture of defiance, her body a shield for the child behind her. In that frozen moment, everything crystallized for Eliza. The memory of the fever, the terror of abandonment, the gnawing cold, and then the warmth of a furry body, the offering of raw meat, the patient lessons, the shared howls at the moon, it all coalesced into a single undeniable truth. The man with the gun was the monster. The wolf was her mother. A sound tore from her throat, a sound she didn't know she was capable of making. It was not a word, not a scream, but a raw, guttural roar of pure protective fury. No! The sound was shocking, animalistic. It was the first human word she had spoken in nearly a year, but it was imbued with the savagery of the wild. As the sound ripped through the air, she moved. She didn't run away from the wolf. She ran to her. In a blur of motion, she threw her small, wiry body in front of the silver she-wolf, spreading her arms wide directly in the line of fire. She stood there, a fierce, wild-eyed creature in a tattered blue dress, her chest heaving, her chin lifted in defiance, daring him to shoot. She was shielding her family. The act was so unexpected, so utterly primal, that it stunned everyone into stillness. Samuel Hartwell's finger froze on the trigger. He stared, his mind unable to process the scene before him. The lost, civilized child he had left for dead was now willingly offering her life to save that of a beast. His pragmatic world, a world of simple, brutal equations, had no formula for this. "Samuel, for the love of God, put it down!" Martha's shriek finally broke the spell. She ran forward, stumbling in the mud, and grabbed his arm, her own surprising strength forcing the rifle barrel towards the ground. "Don't you see? You'll kill her! She's protecting them!" Thomas Wheeler reached them a moment later, his hand closing firmly over Samuel's on the rifle stock. "He's right, Sam," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent, but with a note of wonder in it. "Look at her. Just look. She's not a prisoner. She's one of them." Samuel finally lowered the rifle, his arms trembling slightly. Whether from the strain or from shock, it was impossible to tell. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, astonishment, disgust, and a sliver of something that might have been defeat. He stared at Eliza, who hadn't moved. Her fierce gaze was locked on him, her eyes burning with a righteous fire that he, a man of God and law, could not comprehend. He saw her, but he didn't recognize her. The soft, pliable child was gone. In her place was this changeling, this spirit of the woods, with a wolf's soul shining from a human girl's eyes. "Eliza," Martha pleaded, her voice breaking with sobs. She took a tentative step forward, her hands outstretched. "Eliza, child, come with us. Come home." Home. The word hung in the air, meaningless. Where was home? The creaking wagon that had left her to die? The society of people who measured a life against a schedule? Or the circle of warm bodies that had shared their heat in the dead of night? The choice was not a choice at all. Eliza slowly lowered her arms. She kept one hand resting on the thick fur of Silver's neck, a gesture of both reassurance and possession. She looked from Martha's tear-streaked, pleading face to the wagons, to the frightened, judgmental eyes of the other families who had abandoned her once and would surely never understand her now. Then she looked back at Samuel, at the rifle that was the very symbol of his fear and his world's destructive power. Finally, she turned her head and looked up into the calm, intelligent, yellow eyes of the silver she-wolf. In those eyes, she saw no judgment, no conditions, only a steady, unwavering acceptance. This was loyalty. This was protection. This was family. She looked back at the humans. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a simple gesture, but it was an answer more final than any word. She had no more words for them. She had made her verbal declaration, her one, fierce no, and it was enough. She had defended her world, and now she would choose it, completely and forever. The confrontation was over. The crescendo of her old life had faded, leaving behind the quiet, powerful certainty of her new one. With her choice made, a profound peace settled over Eliza, the tension drained from her body, replaced by a quiet resolve. She did not need to explain, to justify, to plead. Her decision was written in her posture, in the way her hand rested with familiar ease on Silver's fur, in the steady, unafraid gaze she turned upon the people from her past. They were ghosts to her now, echoes of a life that no longer fit. Samuel Hartwell, his face pale and set like stone, finally seemed to understand. He looked at his wife, whose sobs had quieted into a resigned, heartbroken grief. He looked at Thomas Wheeler, whose expression was one of sad understanding. He looked back at the wild girl and the silent pack of wolves that claimed her. He had come back, perhaps driven by a flicker of conscience or his wife's relentless sorrow, to rescue a child. But the child was gone, and the creature that stood in her place wanted no rescue. He had failed, not because he had abandoned her, but because he could no longer comprehend what she had become. With a curt, angry gesture, he wrenched the rifle from Thomas's grasp and strode back to his wagon. "We're leaving," he snapped to the others. "There's nothing for us here." The command broke the tableau. The wagon train families, who had been watching with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, began to stir, eager to put this strange, unsettling place behind them. The sounds of preparation began again, the calls to the oxen, the creak of yokes, the low murmurs of people who would be telling this story for the rest of their days. Martha Hartwell lingered, her heart breaking. "Eliza," she whispered one last time, a final desperate thread of hope. "Please." Eliza met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of the old girl was there. A shadow of sadness for the kindness in this woman's face, a ghost of regret for a world that could have been. But it was only a flicker. She gave no other response. She simply stood her ground, a silent, immovable part of the wilderness. Martha finally let out a shuddering sigh of defeat and allowed Thomas to gently guide her back to the wagon. Eliza watched them mount up. She watched as Samuel cracked his whip, the sound sharp and ugly in the pristine air. The wagons began their slow, lumbering turn, carving new ruts in the mud beside the old, faded ones. This time, as they pulled away, Eliza felt no terror, no despair. She felt nothing but a quiet sense of release. She did not watch them until they disappeared over the ridge. She gave them only a moment's glance before turning her back on them completely. She turned her face toward the deep woods, toward the familiar shadows and the scent of pine and damp earth. Silver nudged her hand with her wet nose, and a younger wolf came to lick her cheek, a gesture of welcome, of reaffirmation. The pack closed in around her, a moving circle of warmth and belonging. She took a step and another, walking away from the clearing, away from the ghost of her past and the tattered remains of the blue dress that lay forgotten on the ground behind her. She walked into the heart of the forest, not as a lost girl, but as a queen, returning to her kingdom. The silver she-wolf trotted at her right side, the rest of the pack flowing around them like a gray river. The canopy of leaves closed above them, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. The sounds of the wagons faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the trees and the soft padding of paws on the forest floor. She never looked back. She didn't need to. Her home was not behind her. It was all around her, and ahead of her, a vast, wild, and honest world. The story of the abandoned child ended there, by the old oak tree. But a new story began, a legend whispered by travelers and trappers for generations to come. They spoke of a spirit of the high Sierras, a ghost girl who ran with wolves, her hair as wild as the branches of the trees, and her eyes as bright and fierce as a hawk's. They said she was a myth, a campfire tale to scare children. But she was real. She was the girl who had been broken by the cold mercy of civilization and reborn in the fierce, compassionate heart of the wild. She was the girl who had been left with nothing, and in that nothing had found everything. She had found trust not in words, but in warmth. She had found love not in blood, but in loyalty. She had found her true home, not in the world of men, but in the soul of the wilderness, and it was a peace that was hard-earned and absolute.